The woman who once swore she'd never leave me now slid divorce papers across our kitchen table. I was stirring my coffee watching the steam rise in lazy spirals when Sarah walked into our kitchen that Tuesday morning with an expression I'd never seen before. Cold, determined, is almost theatrical. In her perfectly manicured hands were official-looking documents that she placed on our granite countertop with the precision of someone playing what they believed was their winning card. "I'm done, Daniel," she announced, her voice carrying that practiced tone she used in corporate presentations. 8 years and I can't pretend anymore. These are divorce papers." The words hung in the air like a challenge. I looked down at the documents, noting the lawyer's letterhead, the official seals, the places marked with yellow sticky notes where signatures were required. Sarah stood there, arms crossed, waiting for what I assume she expected would be my inevitable breakdown. The begging, the pleading, the desperate promises to change, to be better, to somehow win back the woman who had been growing more distant with each passing month. Instead, I reached across the counter and picked up the pen she'd so conveniently placed beside the papers. "You're right," I said quietly, flipping to the first signature page. "We can't keep pretending." The pen moved smoothly across the paper. Daniel Hayes. My signature looked oddly calm, almost elegant, in contrast to the chaos I could feel building in Sarah's energy beside me. "What are you doing?" Her voice cracked slightly, the corporate composure slipping. "Signing the papers. Like you asked." I flipped to the second page, signed again. "You said you were done. I'm respecting that decision." I watched her face transform through a spectrum of emotions I hadn't seen in months. Shock, confusion, then something that looked almost like panic. "Daniel, wait. You can't just… don't you think we should talk about this first?" "Talk?" I looked up from the documents, meeting her eyes directly for the first time in weeks. "Sarah, when was the last time we actually talked? Really talked? Not about schedules or bills or your latest project at work, but about us." She opened her mouth, then closed it. I could see her mind racing, recalculating whatever strategy she'd mapped out for this morning. This clearly wasn't going according to her plan. "I thought you'd fight for us," she said, her voice smaller now, almost vulnerable. It was the first genuine emotion I'd heard from her in months. "Fight for what exactly?" I continued, signing, my voice steady despite the tremor I felt in my chest. "For the marriage where my wife comes home later each night, where she guards her phone like it contains state secrets, where she schedules business dinners 3 times a week but can't remember the last time we had dinner together." Each signature felt liberating, like cutting chains I hadn't realized were binding me. Page after page, I signed away 8 years of marriage, 8 years of trying to be the husband I thought she wanted, 8 years of making excuses for why we were growing apart. "You're being dramatic," Sarah said, but the authority had drained from her voice. "Every marriage goes through rough patches. I've been busy with the Carter Project." "The Carter Project." I repeated the words slowly, watching her face. Was it my imagination, or did she flinch slightly when I said David Carter's name? "Right. Your boss. The one requiring all those late nights and weekend strategy sessions." "It's a big opportunity for my career, Daniel. You know how important." "I know." I signed the final page with a flourish. "Your career has always been important to you, more important than almost everything else, it seems." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah stared at the completed documents as if they were a snake that had suddenly appeared on our counter. This wasn't the script she'd written in her head. I was supposed to crumble. I was supposed to beg her not to leave, to promise I'd be more exciting, more successful, more whatever it was she felt I lacked. Instead, I gathered the papers into a neat stack and handed them back to her. "There," I said, surprised by how calm I sounded. "All signed. Your attorney will probably want these filed as soon as possible." "Daniel." She clutched the papers against her chest like they might disappear. "Maybe we're being hasty. Maybe we should try counseling first, or…" Counseling. The irony wasn't lost on me. Sarah, you walked in here with divorce papers already drawn up. This isn't a spontaneous decision you made this morning. These documents take time to prepare. How long have you been planning this moment? She had no answer for that which was answer enough. I stood up, straightening my tie, a habit from years of morning routines we once shared. I need to get to work. I assume you'll handle the logistics with your lawyer. You can't just leave. We need to talk about this properly. We just did. I paused at the kitchen doorway, looking back at the woman I'd spent 8 years loving, 8 years trying to understand, 8 years building a life with in this suburban dream house. You wanted honesty, Sarah. You wanted to stop pretending. Well, this is me being honest. This is me finally stopping the pretense that we're something we're not. As I walked toward the garage, I could hear her calling my name, her voice carrying notes of desperation I hadn't heard since our early dating days. But I didn't turn around. For the first time in months, maybe years, I was moving forward instead of standing still waiting for her to decide what our life would look like. The garage door opened to reveal the morning I hadn't noticed before, crisp autumn air, golden light filtering through the maple trees we'd planted during our 3rd year of marriage when we still believed in forever. I had no idea what came next, but for the first time in a very long time, that uncertainty felt like possibility rather than fear. The call started before I even reached my office. My phone buzzed insistently against the dashboard as I navigated the familiar route through our neighborhood past the park where Sarah and I used to jog together, past the coffee shop where we'd spent Saturday mornings reading the paper and planning our future. Each vibration felt like an echo of the woman I'd left standing in our kitchen, clutching divorce papers she'd never expected me to sign. I didn't answer. For 8 years, I'd been available to Sarah at every moment, interrupting meetings to take her calls, rushing home when she needed something, rearranging my schedule around her needs. But something fundamental had shifted this morning. The man who signed those papers wasn't the same man who had been pouring coffee 20 minutes earlier. By the time I settled at my desk, there were 7 missed calls and a string of text messages that told a story of escalating panic. Daniel, please call me back. We need to talk about this rationally. I know you're angry, but walking away isn't the solution. This is childish. Come home so we can discuss this like adults. I'm sorry, okay, I was trying to get your attention. The papers were just a wake-up call. That last message stopped me cold. A wake-up call. She'd had divorce papers drawn up as a manipulation tactic, a way to shock me into compliance. The Sarah I'd married would never have been so calculating, so cruel. Or maybe she would have, and I'd been too blind to see it. My phone rang again. This time, I answered. Daniel, thank God. Sarah's voice was breathless, strained. Where are you? I've been trying to reach you for an hour. I'm at work, where I always am at 9:30 on a Tuesday morning. You can't just go to work like nothing happened. We signed divorce papers, Daniel. Divorce papers. You brought me divorce papers, I corrected. I simply honored your request. It wasn't a request, it was... She stopped abruptly, and I could hear her breathing heavily. I was trying to show you how serious our problems have become. I thought if you saw how close we were to losing everything. So this was a test. The pieces were clicking into place with sickening clarity. You had legal documents prepared, walked into our kitchen, announced you were done with our marriage, and expected me to, what beg promised to change. Fight for a woman who's been treating me like a roommate for months. You don't understand the pressure I'm under at work. The Carter Project is make or break for my career. David has been pushing the entire team, and the hours have been insane. And David, I interrupted her, noting how naturally his first name rolled off her tongue. Your boss, the one you've been having so many late-night strategy sessions with. There was a pause, just a fraction of a second. But in that silence, I heard everything I needed to know. It's not what you think. she said quickly. Too quickly. What do I think, Sarah? I don't know. You've been acting suspicious and jealous, making accusations. I haven't made any accusations. I've barely said anything about your schedule or David Carter, or the fact that you guard your phone like it contains nuclear launch codes. I leaned back in my chair, a strange calm settling over me. But it's interesting that your mind went there immediately. You're twisting my words. Am I finally hearing them clearly for the first time? Another pause. When she spoke again, her voice had a different quality, smaller, more vulnerable, but also more desperate. Daniel, I made a mistake this morning. The papers were a stupid idea. I was trying to shock you into seeing how far apart we've grown, but I realize now how it must have looked. Can you please come home so we can talk about this properly? The papers weren't the mistake, Sarah. I watched my colleagues moving through the office, living their normal Tuesday morning lives, while mine was reshaping itself in real time. The mistake was thinking I wouldn't sign them. What's that supposed to mean? It means you've been underestimating me for a long time. You thought you knew exactly how I'd react, didn't you? You thought I'd crumble, maybe cry, definitely beg you to reconsider. You thought I'd promise to be more exciting, more successful, more whatever it is you've been looking for in... I paused deliberately. David Carter. The sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line was all the confirmation I needed. Daniel, it's not. There's nothing. He's my boss, and yes, we work closely together, but... Sarah. My voice was gentle now, almost kind. Stop. Stop what? Stop lying to both of us. Stop pretending that late-night strategy sessions are about marketing campaigns. Stop acting like your sudden interest in weekend team-building exercises has anything to do with professional development. I could hear her crying now, soft hiccups that might have broken my heart 6 months ago. Now they just sounded like the final notes of a song that had been ending for a long time. I never meant for it to happen, she whispered. There it was. The truth I'd been dancing around for months. The reality I'd been too afraid to name, the ending I'd been trying to prevent by being a better husband, a more understanding partner, a more accommodating man. How long? I asked. Daniel, please. How long, Sarah? 3 months, maybe 4. I don't know exactly when it started. It was just work at first, and then you decided to test whether your backup plan was still in place, whether your husband was still stupid enough, still devoted enough, still pathetic enough to take you back after you'd finished exploring your options. It's not like that, isn't it? I stood up, walking to my office window that overlooked the parking lot where I'd sat in my car an hour ago, thinking my biggest problem was a wife who wanted a divorce. You've been having an affair with David Carter. You've been lying to me for months. And this morning, instead of having the courage to end our marriage honestly, you decided to manipulate me into fighting for a relationship you'd already abandoned. The silence stretched between us, filled with 8 years of history and the rubble of whatever future we'd once planned. I'm sorry, she said finally. I'm so sorry, Daniel. I know how it looks, but it's not too late. We can work through this. I'll end things with David. I'll quit my job if I have to. We can start over. I found myself smiling, though there was no humor in it. Sarah, you brought me divorce papers this morning. I signed them. That's not the beginning of a negotiation. It's the end of our marriage. But you love me. I did love you. I loved you enough to sign those papers when you asked me to, instead of forcing you to stay in a marriage you clearly don't want. I do want it. I want us. No, I said quietly. You want the security I represent? You want the backup plan? You want to know that if things don't work out with David Carter, you'll still have a devoted husband waiting at home in your suburban dream house, ready to pretend the last 4 months never happened. I hung up before she could respond, and for the first time in hours, the silence felt like peace instead of emptiness. Mike Reynolds had been my best friend since college, which meant he was one of the few people who could get away with showing up at my office unannounced with coffee and the kind of direct questions that most people would consider invasive. He walked through my door at 11:30 that same Tuesday morning, took one look at my face, and closed the door behind him. "You look like hell," he said, setting a coffee cup on my desk. "Also, Sarah called me 20 minutes ago crying hysterically about how you've lost your mind and signed divorce papers. Want to tell me what's really going on?" I filled him in on the morning's events while Mike listened with the focused attention he usually reserved for his financial planning clients. When I finished, he leaned back in the chair across from my desk and shook his head. "She's having an affair," he said flatly. "I know." "With her boss?" "David Carter." "Yeah." "And she brought you divorce papers as some kind of manipulation tactic to make you fight for her while she's sleeping with another man." That about sums it up. Mike was quiet for a long moment, studying me with the analytical gaze that made him so good at his job. "How are you feeling about all this?" It was a simple question with a complicated answer. Honestly, relieved, angry, betrayed. But mostly clear. For the first time in months, I can see the situation clearly. "Good." Mike pulled out his phone. "Because clarity is exactly what you're going to need for what comes next." "What comes next?" "Daniel, you can't just sign divorce papers and walk away. Not with the assets you two have accumulated. Not with the house, the investments, the joint accounts. Sarah isn't going to make this easy, especially now that her manipulation didn't work." I hadn't thought about the practical implications. For 8 years, Sarah and I had built a life together, financial intertwining that couldn't be undone with a simple signature. The house we'd bought 3 years ago, the retirement accounts, the savings we'd accumulated through careful planning, and my consistent overtime work. "She makes good money," I said. "Her salary isn't that much less than mine." Mike's expression was grim. "Daniel, affairs make people do stupid things. Financial stupid things. Have you looked at your joint accounts lately? Credit card statements, unexplained expenses?" The question hit me like cold water. I realized I hadn't checked our financial statements in months. Sarah had always been meticulous about managing our accounts, and I'd trusted her completely. "I need to get home," I said, already reaching for my jacket. "No." Mike's voice was firm. "You need to be smart about this. If Sarah is panicking, which she clearly is, going home right now while she's emotional is the worst thing you could do. You need documentation first, evidence. You need to understand exactly what you're dealing with before you confront her again." He was right. The software engineer in me appreciated the logical approach, even as every emotional instinct screamed to rush home and demand answers. "What do you suggest?" "First, we go to the bank. You check all your accounts, get statements for the last 6 months. Look for unusual expenses, cash withdrawals, anything that doesn't fit your normal spending patterns. Then we get you a lawyer, a good one." 2 hours later, I was sitting in the customer service area of our bank with a stack of printouts that told a story I should have seen coming. The evidence was there in neat rows of debits and credits, expensive dinners at restaurants I'd never been to, hotel charges during nights when Sarah claimed to be working late, at the office, shopping sprees at high-end stores that far exceeded our usual budget. "Look at this," Mike said, pointing to a series of charges from the previous month. "Dinner for 2 at Le Bernardin. That's a $400 meal minimum. When's the last time you ate at Le Bernardin?" "Never." Sarah said she was at a client dinner that night. "With David Carter." I stared at the statement, feeling something cold settle in my stomach. She said the client was from out of town, a potential new account. Mike continued scanning the statements, his financial advisor's eye-catching patterns I'd missed completely. Hotel charges. Always the same hotel, always on nights when she texted you about working late. Look at the timing, they're not random business expenses. There's a pattern here. The numbers painted a picture of deception that was both systematic and careless. Sarah had been using our joint credit card to finance her affair, apparently confident that I'd never notice or never question the expenses. The trust that had made me blind to her distance had also made me blind to the financial evidence of her betrayal. "How much?" I asked. Mike was adding numbers on his phone calculator. "Conservative estimate, she's spent about $8,000 of your joint money on this affair over the past 4 months. $8,000. Money we'd saved through careful budgeting, money that was supposed to be building toward our future. Instead, it had been funding intimate dinners and hotel rooms for Sarah and David Carter. "There's something else," Mike said quietly. He pointed to a series of large cash withdrawals, each for $500, taken every 2 weeks like clockwork. "What's this about?" I had no idea. Sarah had never mentioned needing regular cash, and $500 every 2 weeks was far more than any reasonable personal expense. "We need to figure out what this is for," Mike said. "People don't take out that kind of cash regularly unless they're trying to hide something that can't be traced." My phone buzzed with another text from Sarah. "Daniel, please come home. I've made us dinner reservations at that Italian place you love. We need to talk this through properly." I showed Mike the message. He shook his head. "She's trying to control the narrative, getting you into a romantic setting where she can manipulate your emotions, make promises about changing, probably blame the affair on work stress or marriage problems you're supposedly responsible for. So what do I do? You get a lawyer today, and you don't make any decisions about reconciliation until you understand exactly what you're dealing with." Mike pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts. "Richard Thompson. He's ruthless, expensive, and exactly what you need right now. He handled my cousin's divorce last year. Similar situation, cheating spouse, complicated assets. He doesn't mess around." As Mike dialed, I looked again at the bank statements spread across the table. 4 months of systematic deception hidden behind late work nights and business dinners. 4 months of my wife financing her affair with our joint money while I worked overtime to secure our financial future. But what bothered me most wasn't the money, it was the calculation behind it. This wasn't a crime of passion or a moment of weakness. This was planned, systematic, ongoing deception. Sarah had been living a double life with the precision of a project manager, and she'd been funding it with the same joint account she used to buy groceries and pay our mortgage. "Thompson can see you at 4, Mike said, hanging up his phone. "His office is downtown, about 10 minutes from here." I gathered the statements into a neat stack, evidence of a marriage that had been ending for months while I was too trusting to notice. "Mike, I need to ask you something." "Shoot." "Did you know before today, did you suspect?" Mike was quiet for a long moment. I wondered. The last few times we all hung out together, Sarah seemed different, distracted, and she kept checking her phone even during conversations. But I figured it was work stress, or maybe you two were going through a rough patch. I never imagined she was capable of this level of deception. "Yeah," I said softly. "Neither did I." But as we walked toward Richard Thompson's office, I realized that wasn't entirely true. Some part of me had known something was wrong. I'd felt the distance, noticed the secrecy, sensed the shift in our relationship. I'd just chosen to trust instead of investigate, to hope instead of confront. That version of myself, the trusting, hopeful Daniel Hayes who'd poured coffee this morning, felt like a stranger now. The man walking into a divorce lawyer's office was someone else entirely. Richard Thompson's office occupied the 32nd floor of a glass tower downtown, with windows that offered a commanding view of the city where Sarah and I had built our life together. The lawyer himself was exactly what Mike had promised, sharp-eyed, impeccably dressed, and radiating the kind of quiet confidence that came from winning battles most people didn't even know were being fought. "Mr. Hayes," he said, gesturing for me to sit across from his mahogany desk. "Mike Reynolds gave me a brief overview of your situation. Your wife initiated divorce proceedings this morning, but you suspect there are complicating factors. I laid out everything: the manipulative divorce papers, Sarah's confession about the affair, the financial evidence Mike and I had uncovered at the bank. Thompson listened without interruption, occasionally making notes in a legal pad with handwriting so precise it looked like typeset text. "How long have you suspected the affair?" he asked when I finished. "Honestly, I think I've been willfully blind for months. The signs were there, but I kept making excuses, trying to be understanding about her work stress." That's common. Betrayed spouses often choose trust over suspicion until the evidence becomes undeniable. Thompson leaned back in his chair. "The question now is whether you want to pursue reconciliation or dissolution." She wants to reconcile, says she'll end the affair, even quit her job. And what do you want? The question hung in the air. What did I want? This morning, I'd wanted my marriage to work. I'd wanted the woman I'd loved for 8 years to stop being distant and secretive. I'd wanted us to find our way back to each other. But that was before I knew about David Carter, before I saw the bank statements, before I realized that Sarah's divorce papers weren't a cry for help. They were a calculated manipulation designed to keep me as her safety net while she explored other options. "I want her to face consequences for what she's done," I said finally. "Not revenge, exactly, but accountability. She's been living a double life for months, using our joint money to finance an affair, lying to my face every day. And when she got scared that David might not be a permanent solution, she tried to manipulate me into fighting for a marriage she'd already abandoned." Thompson nodded approvingly. "Accountability is something we can work with. Now let's talk strategy." For the next hour, Thompson outlined a plan that was both elegant and devastating. The divorce papers Sarah had brought me weren't just signed, they were legally binding. She couldn't simply withdraw them because the manipulation hadn't worked as intended. "The beauty of her strategy backfiring," Thompson explained, "is that she's now in an extremely vulnerable position. She filed for divorce, presumably expecting you to contest it or beg for reconciliation. Instead, you've accepted her terms, which means the divorce will proceed unless she can prove cause for delay. What kind of cause? Duress, coercion, mental incapacity, none of which apply here. She presented the papers voluntarily. You signed them in sound mind after careful consideration. From a legal standpoint, she asked for a divorce, and you granted her request." Thompson's plan was methodical. We would use the next few weeks, while Sarah believed she was convincing me to reconcile, to gather comprehensive documentation of the affair. Financial records, communication evidence, witness statements. By the time Sarah realized that reconciliation wasn't happening, we'd have everything needed to ensure the divorce terms were heavily weighted in my favor. "The adultery gives us significant leverage in asset division," Thompson continued, "particularly given that marital funds were used to support the affair. Courts don't look kindly on that kind of financial infidelity." "What about David Carter?" Thompson's smile was predatory. "What about him if he's been conducting an affair with a subordinate employee? That's a significant liability for their company. HR departments tend to take dim views of supervisors who blur professional and personal boundaries, especially when it creates potential legal exposure." I found myself smiling for the first time all day. "You're suggesting we document everything and then present it to their company's HR department. I'm suggesting we gather evidence and then use it strategically to protect your interests. If that evidence happens to shed light on workplace misconduct that their company should know about?" Thompson shrugged elegantly. "Well, that's just being a responsible corporate citizen." The plan was brilliant in its simplicity. Sarah believed she had time to convince me to forgive her, to accept her promises of change, to rebuild our marriage on her terms. She had no idea that every day she spent trying to manipulate me was another day we were documenting her deception. "One more thing," Thompson said as our meeting concluded. Your wife will likely escalate her efforts when she realizes her initial approach isn't working. She might become more emotional, make bigger promises, possibly even try to turn mutual friends against you by controlling the narrative of your separation. Thus, how do I handle that? You stay focused on the evidence. Emotions are what got you into this situation, trusting when you should have been suspicious, hoping when you should have been documenting. Don't let emotions derail your exit strategy now. As I rode the elevator down from Thompson's office, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: control. For the first time since I'd noticed Sarah's distance, since I'd started making excuses for her behavior, since I'd begun questioning whether I was being paranoid or unreasonable, I had a clear path forward. My phone buzzed with another message from Sarah. Daniel, I know you're angry, but please don't make any permanent decisions while you're upset. Come home tonight and let's talk about our future. Our future. As if we still had one. As if her 4-month affair with David Carter was just a bump in the road that could be smoothed over with the right conversation, the right promises, the right manipulation. I typed back, I'll be home around 7. We should definitely talk. It was true, we needed to talk. But not about reconciliation or forgiveness or the future Sarah was imagining. We needed to talk about accountability consequences and the end of a marriage she'd already destroyed. The difference was that now I'd be the one controlling the conversation. For 8 years, I'd been reactive in our relationship, responding to Sarah's moods, accommodating her needs, adjusting my expectations to match her behavior. But the man walking out of Richard Thompson's office building wasn't the same person who'd signed divorce papers that morning in a fit of hurt and frustration. This version of Daniel Hayes had a plan. And unlike Sarah's manipulation with the divorce papers, my plan was designed to succeed regardless of how she responded. If she wanted to fight, I had evidence and legal representation. If she wanted to negotiate, I held all the leverage. If she wanted to reconcile, she'd discover that some bridges once burned couldn't be rebuilt. The afternoon sun felt warmer as I walked back to my car, and I realized it had nothing to do with the weather. For the first time in months, I wasn't walking toward uncertainty. I was walking toward justice. 6 months later, I was sitting on the deck of what was now officially my house, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of amber and gold. The same deck where Sarah and I had once planned our future together now belonged entirely to me, along with the house, the majority of our investments, and the satisfaction that comes from watching a manipulator face the consequences of their own choices. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, but it had been thorough. True to Richard Thompson's prediction, Sarah had escalated her reconciliation efforts when she realized her emotional appeals weren't working. There had been tears, promises, dramatic declarations of love, and increasingly desperate attempts to rewrite the history of our marriage. She'd painted herself as a woman who'd made a mistake under work pressure, me as a husband who'd been emotionally distant, and David Carter as a manipulative boss who'd taken advantage of her vulnerability. None of it had mattered once the evidence spoke for itself. The financial records Thompson's team had compiled told an unambiguous story of systematic deception. 8 months of affair-related expenses, hidden purchases, and cash withdrawals that Sarah couldn't explain. The communications evidence recovered through legal discovery revealed not a vulnerable woman who'd been manipulated, but someone who'd been actively planning to leave her marriage while maintaining me as a backup option. The most damaging evidence had come from Sarah herself in messages to David Carter that she'd never intended for anyone else to see. Daniel signed the papers like I knew he would. Too predictable. I'll let him think we're reconciling while I figure out if you're ready to make this permanent. He's so pathetically grateful when I show him any attention. I could probably string this along for months. The house is in both our names, but I've been the one making it a home. He'll never fight me for it. Thompson had presented those messages in court with the clinical precision of a surgeon, watching Sarah's face crumble as her own words revealed the calculation behind her manipulation. The judge, a woman in her 50s, who'd clearly seen enough of these cases, had not been sympathetic to Sarah's tearful explanations. The divorce settlement had been swift, and decisive. I kept the house, the majority of our shared investments, and my retirement accounts. Sarah received her own retirement savings and enough assets to start over, but far less than she would have gotten in a no-fault divorce without evidence of financial infidelity. But the real justice had been watching the professional consequences unfold. David Carter, it turned out, was married with 2 teenage children, a fact that Sarah had somehow failed to mention during her tearful confessions about their deep connection. His wife, armed with the same evidence that had destroyed my marriage, had filed her own divorce papers and immediately contacted their company's HR department. The investigation into David's conduct had been swift and merciless. Using company resources to facilitate an affair, creating a hostile work environment through preferential treatment of a subordinate, potential sexual harassment, claims the liability exposure had been too significant for the company to ignore. David was terminated within 2 weeks. Sarah, despite her attempts to frame herself as the victim of workplace manipulation, was transferred to a different department with significantly reduced responsibilities. The Carter Project, her supposed ticket to career advancement, was reassigned to someone else entirely. The last I'd heard through mutual acquaintances, Sarah was living in a small apartment across town, working a lateral position that felt like a demotion, and discovering that David Carter was far less charming when he was unemployed and going through his own contentious divorce. Mike Reynolds had stopped by this evening, as he did every few weeks, carrying beer and the kind of straightforward friendship that had gotten me through the worst months of the divorce process. "Any regrets?" he asked, settling into the chair that used to be Sarah's favorite spot on the deck. I considered the question seriously. 6 months ago, I'd been married to a woman I loved, living in a house that felt like home, believing in a future we were building together. That version of my life was gone forever, replaced by something entirely different. "No," I said finally. "I regret trusting too long, suspecting too little, making excuses when I should have been asking questions, but I don't regret how it ended." "And Sarah ever hear from her?" "She texts occasionally, usually when she's had too much wine, from what I can tell. Apologies, explanations, requests to talk things through properly." I don't respond. Mike nodded approvingly. Good. Nothing she could say now would change anything. He was right. The woman who'd placed divorce papers on our kitchen table that Tuesday morning had made her choice long before she'd walked into the room. She'd chosen David Carter over our marriage, manipulation, over honesty, calculation, over courage. I'd simply chosen to respect her decision rather than fight to change her mind. My phone buzzed with a notification, not from Sarah, but from a dating app I'd cautiously joined the previous month. A message from a woman named Jennifer, a veterinarian who seemed to find my story more inspiring than tragic, who appreciated honesty over grand gestures, who understood that some endings were actually new beginnings. "New romance?" Mike asked, noticing my smile. "Possibility," I said. "She's nothing like Sarah." Good. Sarah was beautiful, ambitious, and completely self-centered. You need someone who's beautiful, ambitious, and actually gives a damn about your happiness. As the sun finished setting behind the trees Sarah and I had planted during happier times, I realized that Mike was right about more than just my dating prospects. The life I was building now, based on honesty, authentic connections, and relationships with people who valued integrity over convenience, was better than the life I'd lost. Sarah had done me a favor with those divorce papers, even if that hadn't been her intention. She'd forced me to stop accepting less than I deserved, stop making excuses for people who didn't respect me, stop clinging to relationships that existed only in my imagination. The justice hadn't been in watching her life fall apart, though I'd be lying if I said there wasn't some satisfaction in seeing consequences catch up with choices. The real justice was in discovering that I was stronger than I'd known, more valuable than I'd believed, and worthy of the kind of love that didn't require manipulation to maintain. 6 months ago, Sarah Hayes had walked into our kitchen with divorce papers designed to scare me into submission. Tonight, Daniel Hayes was sitting on his own deck, planning a second date with a woman who appreciated his honesty, surrounded by friends who valued his loyalty, living a life built on authenticity rather than anxiety. Sometimes the best revenge is simply becoming the person you were always capable of being once you stop letting someone else define your worth. And sometimes, when someone shows you who they really are through their actions, the smartest thing you can do is believe them and build your future accordingly. The stars were coming out now bright and clear in the autumn sky, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, the future looked like a place I wanted to explore rather than endure. Sarah had wanted to scare me with those divorce papers. Instead, she'd set me free.